Let's talk about this new piece by our first guest tonight titled The Unmakeable Joke, published over at The American Mind. Joining us now to discuss is its author, Grayson Quay, a news editor for the Daily Caller. Grayson, thanks for being here tonight.
Thank you for having me back.
Great, so first, give us the overview of your argument in this piece.
So one thing I've noticed, I'm a big fan of stand-up comedy, and one thing I've noticed is there's a lot of comedians that'll do abortion bits, and sometimes they'll even get a little bit edgy with them, but they always seem to be afraid to just take that step over the line and admit that this is wrong and shouldn't be legal. And it just got me thinking, well, why is that? Why is it that comedians will say the most awful thing in the entire world and everyone will laugh at it, which in many ways is a good and healthy thing in society, but for some reason this one thing appears to be off limits, even to the people whose job it is to say things that are off limits.
And I want to read a quote for you from your own article that I think is absolutely perfect for what you were saying just a second ago. You say, they seem to validate journalist Richard Anania's theory that Americans are much more comfortable with infanticide than with restrictions on individual autonomy. So you say the joke is always we should be allowed to kill toddlers. It's never women who get abortions should go to jail. Talk about some of that and how it kind of, is a really negative reflection, I think, of so many in society.
So Richard Hanania, who I disagree with on a lot of things, but he's quite insightful at times, wrote an article trying to explain why every pro-life state-level referendum has failed so far. And his argument was just that ultimately Americans believe so strongly in individual autonomy that they are more willing to accept one slippery slope than the other. That if the pro-choice slippery slope is infanticide and the pro-life slippery slope is, I don't know, going to jail for a miscarriage, which is nonsense, but if that's the choice that they think they're being presented with, they're going to choose the slippery slope that might end in infanticide, because the idea of contemplating restrictions on individual autonomy and duties to your fellow man that place limits on your freedom is just unthinkable to people.
It is interesting to me the different strains of leftism that have brought us here, they've been in play for many, many decades. So I don't want to say, oh, it began about 5-10 years ago, as some people seem to think. But this latest iteration of it, wokeness, the last 5, 6, 7, 8 years or so, where you really started to see it come to fruition in the way that it's developed now, and it's affected all of our lives. But it's interesting that it really came for comedians first. And as you were saying a moment ago, a lot of comedians, their whole shtick is, we're transgressive, we fight against the man, we don't say what's politically correct, but of course then they were kind of the first to cave. And so it kind of brings us into this weird position. On the one hand, I'm not sure if you're familiar with his work, but Jonathan Pageau, he's an iconographer, Eastern Orthodox, he's very smart, philosophical, great thinker, and he talks about how the role of the court jester back in the day with kings and lordships was the idea that the court jester, through his comedy and his humor, he could say certain truths that no one else was allowed to say, and then therefore the king could go, okay, I see what you're saying, I'm going to laugh now, but I'm going to deal with that later. And so that is the kind of the truth-telling part of comedy. And so maybe that's why the left went for the comedians first. But also, not to give comedians, I guess, too much credit, I wonder if just a lot of them also were transgressive because they didn't like those in power, because they wanted to do whatever they wanted. Like you were talking about personal autonomy a second ago. The idea that, this is my body, I don't care who I hurt with it, whatever, whether it's an unborn baby, a spouse, you name it. I'll make jokes about all sorts of horrific things. And now that they think they've gotten those lustful desires sated, well, now they're going to be the man's best friend. No more, I'm against the man, they're with the man. Do you kind of see some of that as well?
On one hand, it would be the naturalist thing in the world for comedians to make fun of the bodily autonomy argument, for instance, because it is a sacred cow for us. It's the God at the top of our secular pantheon. But at the same time, I think you're right that there is this paradox that what they're pushing for is more autonomy and more transgression, and to then turn around and argue against this absolutist view of autonomy and freedom would, kind of undermine the case that they've made for themselves. That's why you get things like Dave Chappelle saying, this really funny joke that if you can abort the baby, I shouldn't have to pay child support because I should at least be allowed to abandon it. But at the same time, he hedges this bit by saying, but of course, women should be allowed to do this. Men can't have an opinion, right?